Um, Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hamza Sarbilan, and I'm a research master's student at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute. And the title of the talk today is Modern Islamism versus Pre-Modern Islamic Governance. Before I begin, I just want to caveat that I will be making a lot of general statements, generalizations. We're dealing with complex phenomenon, complex issues, but just try and see the story for what it is, like broad paradigms and broad strokes, if you will. Okay, so the Taliban's reimposition of its governance in Afghanistan brings to the fore once more one of the defining tensions for Muslims today, the nature of Islamic politics. So my talk today has two objectives. First, I want to put forward an appreciation of a perspective that modern Islamism has a problematic and coercive basis. And number two, an appreciation that distinguishing between pre-modern and modern Islamic governance is an extremely productive marker for aiding in rethinking a better Islamic politics going forward. So Islamism, Islamic politics, political Islam, lots of debate about these terminologies, but I'm just going to collapse them all into one, right? For the purposes of this talk. It's a global and complex phenomena, different intensities, different contexts, non-state actors, Islamic republics, whatever, right? Very, very complicated. But I think there are a few common characteristics. So number one, Islamism or political Islam views Sharia as primarily a legal penal phenomenon. It seeks a homogenized public sphere. It sees the state as responsible for bringing about moral rectitude. It sees the state as the interpreter and implementer of Islamic law. And it is imbued with a thorough coercive and even totalitarian logic embedded within. And Islamism, as I invoke it, is in the Maududian, Khomeinian, Qutubian sense. So think of the kind of articulations they made, and these are three incredibly influential figures of 20th century Muslim thought, political thought. So all of these aspects, they have the goal of realizing a moral, God-conscious society. And as Muslims, adherents to normative tradition, I think the goal is universally agreed upon. Yet I think we have good empirical, philosophical, theological, and historical reasons to doubt the means. As agents and actors, the means we appropriate will invariably affect us and have the potential to corrupt not just us, but the ends as well. Now, as political thinkers, if we see the means as objectionable, while still advocating a divergence with a Western secular normativity, so while still wanting the same end, the question then becomes, what should Islamic politics ought to look like? Can Islamism look different? In asking questions about the future, I propose answers may lie in the past. I argue that Islamism is statist and coercive and deeply inconsistent to the spirit of traditional pre-colonial Islamic governance. This prior model of Islamic politics conceived of law and state in qualitatively different ways and was grounded in a thorough appreciation of the limits of coercion in realizing spiritual objectives. Because a God-conscious moral society is ultimately a spiritual objective, not necessarily a purely political one. And I argue that, or I assert that the totalitarian or authoritarian spirit embedded in modern Islamism undermines its end goal. Recovering the prior moral spirit will legitimate new ways to think about and conduct Islamic politics. I note that last night's keynote speaker in the conference, Dr. Ibrahim Abdul Wahid's focus on prophetic covenants is precisely one such attempt to redefine our understandings of Islamic politics away from an axis of domination and coercion to a focus on social cooperation and maqasid-based approach. So my work, this presentation, seeks the same conclusion, but on a parallel path. And my approach here is based on and building on from the work of Columbia University Professor Wael Halak in his seminal 2012 book, The Impossible State, which I highly suggest reading. Really opens up a fresh perspective to thinking about Islamic politics. Halak scholarship is, of course, extensive, complicated, multifaceted, but I have a few points of emphasis. So Halak has two main points. He says that Islamism is embracive of the modern state, but that this modern state is a historically bounded form of power relations rooted in the European Enlightenment and premised on a dominating logic. And the second part, he says, is that pre-modern Islamic governance had qualitatively different, less coercive, non-status, spiritually grounded governance ethic. Okay, let's start with the first point. What is the state? What's modern about the state, right? It may seem a strange question given the ubiquity of its form in contemporary life. Foucault has a brilliant statement where he says, what if the state were nothing more than a way of governing? I stress the state then is a fundamentally new form of political power and organization. Of course, governance, laws, discipline, authority are universal constants of human sociality, but we make a deliberate distinction between these concepts and the way they manifest in modernity. So the state then is not an organic entity, but in the words of political scientist Andrew March, represents an asteroid that crashed into the ecology of pre-modern Muslim society, yet remains untheorized and uncriticized. So while Islamists assume the state as a natural tool, Halak, drawing on a wide spectrum of scholarship, invokes the state in a different way. It's complicated, it's deep, but basically, European and world history bears out that the modern state is essentially a violent, disruptive enterprise. So Charles Tilly, for example, minces no words when he labels modern state formation as a quintessential protection racket, with the advantage of legitimacy, our largest examples of organized crime. Foucault writes of the state as embodying a knowledge of the conscience and an ability to direct it, demanding exhaustive, total, and permanent relationship of individual obedience. That's exactly what I think of when I look at what's happening, for example, to the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. And Weber, of course, writes of the state as embodying processes of centralization, domination, monopolization. And Carl Schmitt says that in a rapidly secularizing Europe, the state became and has become God. The point is that modern statecraft, taken to its functional conclusion, is unprecedented in its legitimization of forced social change. It contains an embedded rational logic. Society and the people within it are an object of problems to be solved, to be controlled, mastered, improved, and remade, a legitimate target for social engineering. The state is the essential lever and device with which to initiate total transformation. It constructs, shapes, and alters citizen subjects in its own image. Now, this can only happen because regardless of the flavor on top, socialist state, liberal state, Islamic state, whatever, right? The state itself is the political manifestation of an atheistic, utopian impulse grounded in the European Enlightenment, which was a process or a revolution, if you will, which sought to eliminate God from any meaningful role in human affairs. And the argument goes, what happens when you remove God? Well, morality loses stability, and political action has no reference for legitimacy other than itself. When the state is gone, when God is gone, the state becomes the new locus of power and authority. And this is the real meaning of Schmitt's assertion: the state has only been possible in the West. The state as God logically and necessarily claims full authority to shape those in its remit. Now, this is not just a rhetorical point, but the legitimation of a very real and direct manipulation of the citizen subject. Announcement of unprecedented violence. The Bosnian intellectual Ali Izetbegovic writes that Enlightenment, utopia, and modern state rest on a negation of the human soul. Yet, modern Islamism is embedded precisely in this logic. It seeks to reintroduce God's sovereignty into public life in a meaningful way, yet like the secular formations it desires to displace, it fashions a new God in the state. This unholy union of normative Islamic politics and Enlightenment dominating ethic goes in part to explain why modern Islamism is the way it is. Okay, Now, the second part of Halak's approach, and this is the juicy part, this is the interesting part, I guess, or the fresh part, is that pre-modern Islamic governance was not like its modern Islamist descendant at all. It was normatively, empirically, by capacity and design, less coercive and not interested in heavy-handed governance of daily lives of subjects. We simply don't see a history of religious totalitarianism or authoritarianism in Muslim societies when we look at the historical record. Now, Halak speaks in terms of a paradigm, generalities, where exemptions do exist, but they prove the generality. Now, again here, this is not a defense of imperial or kingly entities, but it's a study of Islamic law, and it notes how Islamic law and society functioned and functioned well despite these imperial entities. Okay, so how did pre-modern Islamic governance work then? How did it work towards its ultimate good, a God-conscious moral society? I would say it had the following characteristics. Sharia was understood as a moral, legal ethic, plural, flexible, and unfixed. Government, while implementing law, didn't write it. The operation of Sharia at its most optimal was independent of executive power, and at its least optimal, parallel to it. Yet in the modern state, everything's collapsed into the state. So there's no separate loci of law or authority in that sense. Law was seen as regulating a base level of public order, but not really interested in private morality. Don't really have evidence for this. And Sharia was the outcome of socially grounded specialists embedded within and produced by the society it was enveloped by. And Halak even calls this a form of popular representation. And lastly, there was an embedded appreciation of the importance of practices and communities of self-regulation and self-purification as essential tools for fashioning the moral subject. So this is remarkably different to the modern Islamist model. Here you see the agent of moral change is not the state, but the individuals themselves. And Sharia is understood as moral principles first, then developed by independent scholars, independent of executive or government authority. Law is not the property of the executive, but the executive was compelled to operate within a sphere of action legitimated by Islamic values. And importantly, the way law and society, but not always politics, functioned was, broadly speaking, self-understood as Islamic, precisely because it was thought to authentically follow the Quranic and prophetic ethical value system. The thing is, Islamists see everything after the Rashidun as broken and inauthentic, but that's not necessarily how the people at the time saw it. Now, I'm happy to report that the latest post-colonial scholarship on Mughal, Ottoman, and Mamluk society seems to confirm what Halak is saying. Now, this is serious, multidisciplinary, rigorous work looking at primary source material. Now, see, Halak he did his work, or he draws his evidence from the Ottoman and Mughal, Mamluk context, but not in the Mughal context. Yet when scholars do serious work on the Mughals and Mughal India, it seems that Halak's thesis travels across time and space, which I think is very, very significant. Now, let's compare. Tables are awesome, they distill complex information. Let's compare the broad principles of modern Islamism and pre-modern Islamic governance to make this contrast very clear. And let's focus specifically on, modern Islamism makes the state the primary agent of change, and there's an emphasis on punishment and a coercive logic. And the state is the arbitrator and the interpreter and the implementer of Sharia. The state basically, Islam is what the state says it is, right? But if we look in the pre-modern context, we find a very, very different approach. The individual is responsible for moral rectification. There's a deep spiritual normative logic underpinning all of this. The state is one actor amongst many. So you have the ulama, you have Sufi brotherhoods, which were very important in the pre-modern context, customary law, all these different, loci of power. And again, Sharia was seen as a moral ethic first, then a legal code. But in the modern context, it's seen as a legal code first, and maybe only a legal code. So there's a profound difference in the approaches. And we should see European colonialism as the decisive break between the two. Colonialism is this deeply destructive and traumatic process that has changed nearly every facet of Muslim life and thinking. And we can locate the shift in these models in that colonial process. And finally, what does it mean to look to the past? What does it mean to suggest that pre-modern Islamic politics did certain things better? Firstly, claims to the past are the source of legitimacy in Islamic discourse. Islamists make big claims to Muslim past, and they've captured the popular imagination. So reform-minded Muslim political thinkers need to step up and get in the game as well. Secondly, there's a reclamation of pride in Muslim history. It's a deeply decolonial maneuver. Thirdly, it's about the reclamation of an indigenous governance ethic, unsullied by domineering Enlightenment and colonial influence. Of course, not everything should be revived, but some facets of what was lost bear serious consideration. And lastly, and most importantly, this tells us that the present orthodoxy of Islamism, statist, coercive, dominating, doesn't have to be the only way. There are multiple Islamisms, multiple political, ethical frameworks within the Islamic tradition. It doesn't have to be the Islamism we see today, and not because the West is lecturing us to do so, but because Muslim civilization already did it in our past, a past that demands consideration. Thank you.